We're really delighted to have with us this evening Richard Rothstein, who's written a very important, very provocative book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Right at the start of the book, Richard boldly states his case, saying that contrary to what many others believe, segregated neighborhoods in this country did not result mostly from individual prejudices, personal choices, or the actions of such private institutions as banks and real estate agencies, but rather were a consequence of public policy, a purposeful, systematic, forceful government action. How could that be, you might ask? After all, isn't residential racial segregation by state action unconstitutional? That's clear enough today, but it wasn't until well into the last century. And as Richard notes in his book, even Justice John Roberts and some of his colleagues on the Supreme Court have remained apparently ill-informed about the government's role in the racial segregation of housing and the devastating impact this has had on the lives of Black Americans. Richard has spent a career working on the economic and social aspects of education. He's been associated with the Economic Policy Institute for most of the past 3 decades. Guess we have some EPI enthusiasts here. And his several previous works have addressed various education issues, including public and private schools, charter schools, and the black-white achievement gap. His first suspicions that government-engineered residential segregation might be tied to America's broader racial problems occurred half a century ago when, as a very young researcher, he assisted in a case in Chicago collecting evidence that the government had purposefully used public housing to ensure that African Americans were concentrated away from white neighborhoods. In his new book, Richard describes how laws and policy decisions passed by local, state, and federal governments promoted discriminatory patterns and the development of racially homogeneous neighborhoods. The measures included explicit racial zoning, officially segregated public housing, redlining of mortgages, and the conditioning of FHA subsidies for builders on no homes being sold to African Americans. Richard argues that as a nation, we have an obligation to remedy the lasting effects of this segregation and have paid an enormous price in the form of wide income disparities and other inequalities by allowing this injustice to fester. Now, several prominent and authoritative works have told some of this story of official responsibility before, but as the subtitle of Richard's book says, much of this history has been largely forgotten, and Richard has both revived it, helped to collect it all in one work, and added fresh material and perspective. In the wake of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the tensions in such cities as Ferguson, Baltimore, Milwaukee, and Charlotte, and the new attention being paid to possible remedies, Richard's extensively researched and compelling book is particularly timely. Richard anticipates he'll get pushback on some of his arguments. In the years he spent refining his case, he talked to quite a few people and encountered a number of objections. So preemptively, he's included a frequently asked questions section at the end of the book in which he raises such issues as, why should today's standards be applied to yesterday's leaders? Or why should people today have to sacrifice to correct past injustices? And he provides answers. Now, one of the last questions he poses asks whether he supports paying reparations to African Americans, a case made by Ta-Nehisi Coates in several articles in the Atlantic. Now, as it happens, we're very fortunate also to have with us this evening Ta-Nehisi. who's here to be in conversation with Richard. And no doubt they'll get to the reparations proposal. Ta-Nehisi, of course, is a national correspondent for The Atlantic and the author of 2 books, a memoir, The Beautiful Struggle, and Between the World and Me, a passionate, powerful meditation on what it means to be black in America today, a book which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2015, and he's got another book coming out this fall, so stay tuned. There's another significance to having Ta-Nehisi share the stage here with Richard. For a number of years, while researching state-sponsored segregation, Richard really hadn't intended to write a book, just articles and speeches. But 2 years ago, Ta-Nehisi suggested the book and put Richard in touch with his agent, and here we are this evening. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Richard Rothstein and Ta-Nehisi Coates.
So it really is an honor to be here with Richard for 2 reasons. And the first is I say this all the time. I'm a journalist, and what that means is my work is deeply dependent on reporting, talking to people, getting to know people, getting into people's lives. But it's based in people who have really the time and the inclination to do the kind of deep research that Richard does and that he demonstrates in his book. For all the praise that I get for the work that I do, I try to make it clear over and over again that it's really rooted in folks who do that kind of deep research that goes to the bones of our country and really just unearths, some of the things that we are not so interested in talking about. So I'm deeply thankful to Richard, and so I'm just, paying back the favor by being here in conversation with him. The second part of this is that there is a notion that I have, been doing whatever I can to reverse in this country. For a long time, we have conceived of ourselves as a country with a quote-unquote racial problem, and underneath of that is the notion that there are pure races that exist in this country, a white race that hails from Europe, a black race that hails from Africa, Asian race that hails from Asia, a Latino race that hails from I don't quite know where, and increasingly even an Arab and a Muslim race. I mean, this is the sort of path that we're going down. And what that language does is it obscures the fact that race and racism in America is a done thing, that the actual name comes after the attempt to take something from somebody happens. And so what that allows us to do as a country is to feel like we're dealing with some sort of divine, God-made problem or a problem of genes, when in fact we're actually dealing with the things that were done by our ancestors and that I would argue that we continue to do to this very day. The historian Barbara Fields has a term for this. It's called racecraft, and that's the way in which racism, the things that people actually do, become transfigured into the idea of race, an actual label. Tonight we're going to talk about a particular act of racecraft, and that is the idea of how race is increasingly or was created in the past and continues to be created to this very day through our housing policies in this country. So Richard, I thought it would be good if we just started there, if you could just talk about why housing and where the place that housing occupies in the American imagination and also just in our daily lives. Sure.
Well, let me say it this way. The fact that we are living separately, that every metropolitan area in this country is racially segregated, has enormous implications for the country as a whole and for many of the problems that we face. I spent a lot of time writing about the achievement gap between African American and white children. A good part of that achievement gap is attributable to the fact that when you concentrate children with serious social and economic disadvantages in single schools, they can't possibly achieve at the levels that they would achieve, even with those same social and economic disadvantages, if they were in schools where those problems weren't predominant. So, for example, we know that African American children have generally poorer health than white children, so they're absent more often. Well, if a few children are absent in the class, the teacher can accommodate to that. The teacher can pay special attention to the children who need special help. If every child in the class is in poorer health than typical middle-class children, then there's no way to give every child special help. The curriculum as a whole has to become more remedial. If a few children in class are stressed because of economic insecurity, because their parents are unemployed and are acting out, teacher can deal with that. If every child in the class is coming to school under stress, attention, much more resources and attention have to be spent to behavioral issues than to instruction. So it affects the fact that children are concentrated with these disadvantages in single schools, affects the major education problem we face. We spent a lot of time in the last few years focused on confrontations between police and young African American men. That's strictly a function of residential segregation. If we did not have residential segregation, police would behave to serve and protect their communities, not as occupying colonial forces. And young men would not be hopeless because they were living in communities where there were no jobs and no access to jobs and no transportation, and attending, as I said, schools where teachers have difficulty accommodating the overwhelming problems that they face. So that problem stems from residential segregation. We're concerned about growing inequality in this country. Growing inequality, economic inequality, is driven by, in part, by residential segregation. We know from research, for example, that low-income children who grow up in a middle-class neighborhood are much more likely to be middle-class as adults than low-income children who grow up in a segregated neighborhood. So many of the problems we face in this society stem from residential segregation, and that's why I thought it was important to explore how it happened and what we might do about it.
So why don't you take us back? Actually, before that, I want to ask you a question. Why is it that segregation necessarily has to lead to worse outcomes for African Americans? For instance, why can it not be, for instance, the old trope of separate but equal? Is it the mere fact of living separately, or are there other things that come with that?
Well, as I said, it's primarily because lower income children who are concentrated in single classrooms reinforce each other's problems and prevent teachers from being able to address those individual problems without disrupting the entire class. If every child in the class has those problems, then it's become more difficult to deal with. Now, I guess you could say that if you could integrate low-income African American children throughout middle-class African American neighborhoods, you wouldn't have those problems, and that's true. But as we all know, the income distribution in the African American community is lower than the income distribution in the white community, in part because of the history of residential segregation. So that's not a realistic policy alternative at this point. So I would never suggest, and I don't suggest, that black children have to sit next to white children in order to learn. But low-income children, who tend to be disproportionately African American in this country, have to sit next to middle-class children in order to have a productive learning environment.
And it's not merely that these African American children come from low-income households. One of the points you make is they also come from low-wealth households.
Well, yes, they come from low-wealth households, and that's a legacy of residential segregation, and I can talk about that now or later if you want.
Please do.
Well,
no, because I think it's really, really important. It's not merely the living apart.
Well, the wealth difference is essential, but it's just going to be a long answer. So fasten your seatbelt.
They're here to hear you. It's an important answer.
Most people think of residential segregation today as something, and the Supreme Court coined the term. They call it de facto segregation. It's something that happened by accident. It happened because of private prejudice. It happened because of real estate agents who steered people to different places. It happened because people choose to live with one another of the same race. And under the constitutional theory that the Supreme Court has adopted and that most of us believe, and I accept for the purpose of this argument, even though it may not be a good constitutional theory, but you can only have one fight at a time. So I accept this distinction. Under our current constitutional theory, if something happens through private action, there's no constitutional remedy. And if it happens by state action, federal, state, and local action, then not only is there a constitutional remedy, but there's a constitutional obligation to remedy it. So this wealth gap that you're talking about, as well as many of the other problems that I've alluded to already, arose because of a history of state-sponsored segregation, and that's, the subtitle of my book is A Forgotten History, because it was once well known. It's not a hidden history, it's a forgotten history. So there are two main aspects of it, and like I say, I have to describe both of them, how they interacted with each other in order to answer your question. The first is public housing. Now, most of us think of public housing as a place where low-income, mostly minority families live, sometimes high-rises, vertical slums, low incomes, unemployed, single parents. That's our image of public housing. In fact, that's not how public housing began in this country. It's a fairly recent development. Public housing began in the New Deal under the Roosevelt administration during the Depression as a program for white middle-class and lower middle-class families, primarily, who were homeless during the Depression and who lost their homes during the Depression. Some projects were built for African Americans, a few. That's what made the Roosevelt administration progressive. Other administrations might have built public housing only for whites, and not a few projects for African Americans. So in cities across the country, these segregated projects were built. Skipping ahead a bit, it started in the New Deal. The New Deal public housing program often segregated neighborhoods that were never segregated before. In the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, there were many integrated neighborhoods in many metropolitan areas of this country, both the North and the South. Workers of all races and both races and all ethnicities had to live close enough to each other in order to be able to walk to work. They didn't have automobiles, they didn't have good long-distance transportation, so you had neighborhoods that were integrated at the time that we don't have anymore today. I talk in the book about Ta-Nehisi Coates, about Langston Hughes' autobiography.
I'll take it.
Well, you can write an autobiography too, you have. About Langston Hughes' autobiography, in which, the Big C, in which he describes how he grew up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood. His best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl in high school. It was an integrated neighborhood in Cleveland. The federal government came into that neighborhood, demolished it on the guise of slum clearance, and built segregated public housing, segregating this Cleveland neighborhood that had never known segregation before. It built a separate project for whites and a separate project for blacks. Skipping ahead, and this is getting closer to the answer to your question, but we're not there yet. Skipping ahead, this went on through World War II. The defense housing for workers who migrated to centers of defense production was built by the federal government on a segregated basis. Many of these cities had no African American populations before the war, so they weren't preserving segregation, they were creating segregation. In California, there were very few African Americans living there. The big center of shipbuilding, for example, the federal government segregated those cities that were all white before the war, and by the end of the war were completely segregated metropolitan areas. So this is not a Southern thing. So in 1949, getting closer, in 1949, President Truman proposed a massive expansion of the public housing program. And because there was an enormous civilian housing shortage even then, at the end, after World War II, no materials were permitted to be used during the war for civilian housing construction, and all these veterans returning to the country needing housing. And so President Truman proposed this enormous public housing program, again, primarily for white families. Just to emphasize this point, in the early years of public housing, cities had social workers visit the homes of applicants to public housing, white families, and to make sure that their children were well behaved and that they had good enough furniture to put into the public housing, and they had to show a marriage certificate to prove that they or not, you know what. So that was what public housing was. So President Truman proposed this bill, and conservatives in Congress who wanted to defeat the public housing bill, not for race reasons, because remember, this was for whites primarily, wanted to defeat the public housing bill because they were opposed to any public involvement in the private housing market. They thought the private sector should take care of it, even though the private sector wasn't taking care of it. And so they wanted to defeat this, and the way they came up to defeat this was with a poison pill amendment. The poison pill amendment is an amendment that opponents of a bill put on a bill in hopes that the amendment will pass and then make the entire bill palatable. So conservatives in Congress put an amendment onto the Truman's housing bill that from now on, public housing had to be integrated. As I say, there's no secret about the fact that public housing before that was segregated across the country in the North. But they put on an amendment that had to be integrated, the idea being that if liberals supported the integration amendment and conservatives who were opposed to public housing also supported it, the amendment would pass, then the entire bill would require integration, and then Southern Democrats would abandon the bill and the bill would fail. So liberals in Congress fought against the integration amendment, led by Hubert Humphrey, led by Paul Douglas, another great liberal at the time. They fought against the integration amendment. The integration amendment was defeated, so the 1949 Housing Act was passed to continue the policy of segregation that the federal government had followed. So that's how we got these giant towers, Cabrini Green in Chicago, or the Robert Taylor homes, or Pruitt-Igoe, perhaps the most well-known of these projects. I'm getting closer. Now these were segregated. Remember, we think of the Pruitt-Igoe towers as these towers filled with low-income black people, but actually the Pruitt towers were for African Americans, the Igoe towers were for whites. Not de facto, not because African Americans happened to apply to Pruitt and whites happened to apply to Igoe. This is how they were designated. They were filled this way, and after a few years, the white tower, the Igoe tower, was vacant, largely vacant. And the Pruitt tower had long waiting lists. Getting closer. So why is it that after all these years, the white public housing, and this happened all over the country, white public housing had vacancies and black public housing had long waiting lists? And the reason is another federal program run by the Federal Housing Administration that subsidized the movement of white families out of central cities into single-family homes in the suburbs that were exclusively white. So the federal government guaranteed loans to mass production builders. The most famous example, perhaps, is Levittown. Levitt could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. He got loans guaranteed by the federal government on explicit condition, I want to emphasize that no homes be sold to African Americans, and that every home in the development had to have a clause in the deed prohibiting resale to African Americans. Okay, now I can get to your question. The entire country was suburbanized in this way. Whites were moved out of cities. African Americans had to remain in cities and became poorer because industry moved out of central cities as well as at the same time that whites were. The entire country became suburbanized. In 1947-48, when Levitt built that development in east of New York City, those homes sold for $7,000, $8,000 apiece. Today's money, that's about $100,000. African Americans who were equally capable of paying that money for a house, especially if they had an FHA mortgage and a VA a no down payment policy, they could have, in fact, they paid less in their monthly carrying charges for those houses than they were paying in rent for public housing. They paid less, to own a home in Levittown than they were paying in rent in public housing. Well, today, those homes sell for $300,000, $400,000. Here's your question. The African American families who were prohibited from moving into those homes and rented apartments in the city did not gain $200,000, $300,000 in equity over the next two generations. White families gained that equity and today, those homes are unaffordable to working class people. $100,000 in 1940, in our terms, in 1947-48 was twice national median income. Working class families can afford to buy homes for twice national median income with an FHA mortgage. Today, those homes sell for seven times national median income. Working class families, and you all know this, middle class families can't even afford to move to these suburbs that were created as segregated enclaves in the 40s and 50s. So today, nationwide, we have a ratio in income. African American income on average is about 60% of white income. African American wealth is 5 to 7% of white wealth. Most families in this country gain their wealth through housing equity. This enormous difference between 60% income ratio and 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the 1930s, 40s, and into the 50s. So the wealth gap, I think, is attributable to this residential segregation.
You just laid out this wonderful history, well, not wonderful in what it actually did, but wonderful in how you synthesized it, in which you have African Americans confined to one track of housing and white Americans gifted, I would say, to another tract of housing, an opportunity to build wealth for one group and state subsidized opportunity, not a private investment opportunity, a state subsidized opportunity, and another one in which African Americans were excluded from. And obviously, I agree with you in terms of the consequences being profound from that. But it begs the question, why? Why was this done?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. That's not the sort of thing that researchers can, that's not in the papers. That's not in the archives, so I can speculate about it. That's something for journalists to speculate about. But I think there were several reasons. First of all, we have to remember that the Roosevelt administration, progressive though it was on economic issues, was still an expression of the white Anglo-Saxon ruling class. We're familiar, for example, with their refusal to admit refugees from Nazi Germany, to their anti-Semitism. So the fact that they considered whites a superior race is not surprising. There's been a lot written about how, in many cases, the Roosevelt administration unwillingly, or reluctantly rather, made compromises with Southern Democrats to exclude African Americans from benefits of the New Deal. So occupations where African Americans were predominant were excluded from Social Security or the minimum wage. But that doesn't apply to housing, because Southern Democrats were perfectly content to have integrated housing in the North. Social Security is a national program, so if it was going to exclude African Americans, it had to do it nationwide. Southern Democrats were perfectly willing to have integration in the North as long as they could preserve segregation in the South. Going back to the time of slavery, there was never a dispute about whether slavery could be prohibited in the North. We had some border state problems in Missouri and Kansas, but basically the North was free to integrate so long as the South could preserve segregation. So that doesn't explain this housing issue. The other reason, I think, is that, well, I guess it's not really an answer to your question of why they did it. It's a reason of why it's so hard to think about this problem. And that is that, we've desegregated formally every other area of American life. But when we desegregate buses, the next day, African Americans could sit anywhere on a bus. When we desegregated lunch counters, the next day, African Americans could sit down at a lunch counter. We desegregated schools. The next day, African Americans could go to their neighborhood school if the desegregation was enforced. But if we desegregate neighborhoods, what happens? I mean, how do we put our heads around what we're going to do? The next day, African Americans can move to affluent suburbs just because we've passed a law banning segregation. So it's very difficult to think about this problem. And I think that as a result, we've avoided it. And we've come up with this myth to protect us from thinking about it. And the myth is that it all happened by private action, and we call it de facto. And therefore, if it happened by accident, it can only be undone by accident. We don't have to worry about it.
It also allows the state and the citizenry to evade responsibility. If it wasn't the state that actually acted, then who can actually control for that?
Right.
One of the things I find most powerful about this narrative is that there's this common idea where racism is basically linked to a conservative South, and everything bad sort of flows out of that. What does it mean that you have a situation in which not just an administration that's praised by liberals, but when folks wanted to, for instance, critique President Barack Obama during his term, they would often compare him to Roosevelt. This is seen as the liberal standard at a high point of 20th century progressivism. What does it mean that that was the exact point where a lot of this policy that ultimately deprived African Americans of wealth actually began? What does that tell us about the possibilities in terms of any sort of ridding ourselves of the phantoms that it goes to white supremacy and racism, et cetera, that is so pervasive across?
Well, I don't know that I'd go that far. The New Deal was the first administration that was actively involved in the American economy. So there was no opportunity to implement these policies beforehand. It's not that previous administrations were less racist, although some were and some weren't. I mean, the Wilson administration was explicitly racist. The Harding and Coolidge and Hoover administrations a little bit less so. But none of them were involved in the American economy. It was the New Deal that first got involved in the American economy, got involved in housing. The first civilian housing was built in the New Deal. There was no civilian housing before that. So I don't know that this happened because the Roosevelt administration was more racist than others. In fact, it was relatively progressive. I mean, I hate to say this, but it was relatively progressive on race because it built some housing for African Americans. The likelihood is that previous administrations, if they'd done this, would have built only housing for white families. So, I don't know,
I just want to push you on that a little bit.
Please.
But yet, I mean, if we follow the implication of your work, much of the inequality that we see between African American people and whites can be traced to this progressive action.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's because the inequality could only be created by government if it was involved in the economy. And if the government wasn't involved in the economy, it couldn't create this kind of inequality. So it was the opportunity to be involved in the economy that gave the opportunity to segregate.
So what does this call us to do now?
Well, as you heard, I gave a lot of lectures as I was doing this research and wrote articles, and people always ask me that question. And I didn't want to answer it. Finally, I got pestered enough that I threw a chapter in here in the book about remedies. But I don't think that we can really creatively think about remedies until we disabuse ourselves of this myth of private causation. Because so long as we have this consensus, and it's across the political spectrum, it's conservatives and liberals alike who use this term de facto segregation. I'm sure most of this room think of it as de facto segregation. As long as we have that national consensus, we are hobbled in our ability to think creatively of remedies. So let me give you, I will give you a radical answer, which I think is absurd because there's no political consensus that would support it. But I gave you the example before of Levittown. If we understood that this history was state-sponsored segregation, it was unconstitutional, a violation of the 14th Amendment, I argue in the book even of the 13th Amendment, we might do the following. Congress might, 15% of the metropolitan area, New York metropolitan area is African American. Congress might adopt a program where the federal government buys up the next 15% of homes in Levittown for $400,000 and resells them to qualified African Americans for $100,000. That would be a constitutionally justifiable remedy in terms of the, in light of the history that I've just described. But, well, I guess I just did say it in public. I was going to say I would never say that in public, but I just did. But, it can't be, that kind of thing can't be debated unless we understand the history. So what we should be doing now is trying to do everything we can, and you are a star in this area, to make people familiar with the history. I mean, your article about Chicago, the case for reparations, did this. A writer for the New York Times Magazine now, Nicole Hannah-Jones has been writing about it. We need to talk about this, make this a part of our national conversation so that we can begin to conceive of these remedies. There may be remedies that people will think of that I haven't thought of once we can begin to have a conversation about it. But we can't have the conversation about it so long as we have this myth. And let me add this one thing, a very simple thing. One of the things I report in the book is I examined all the most commonly used high school textbooks in America today. And every single one of them lies about this history. They lie about it. And that's a very simple thing to fix. If we don't fix it, the next generation is going to be no better position to do something about it than ours has been. But the most widely used American history textbook, it's 1,000 pages. The kids, I guess, they carry it around in backpacks. Has one paragraph in the entire 1,000-page book devoted to segregation in the North. Within that paragraph, it has one sentence devoted to housing, and the sentence reads as follows. In the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated housing. That's it. Passive voice, no discussion of who did the forcing, how it happened. They woke up one morning, they looked out the window and said, whoopie-doo, here we are in a segregated neighborhood. So long as we're teaching our young people that, there's very little hope of having a serious conversation about remedies. And I think you've said in your articles that the first step has to be understanding this history before we can begin seriously to talk about remedying it.
Agreed. I am being instructed to now throw it to the audience. So I believe we're going to take some questions from the audience.
Yes, I was wondering if you could comment on housing segregation being a result partially due to the fact that when many GIs returning from the war, they got the GI Bill, and I think they also got money for a mortgage. But I understood that while African Americans also received that GI Bill, they usually couldn't find a bank that would give them a loan, or they couldn't find a school that would take them. And how does that compare to the disparity in asset accumulation versus what you just laid out?
Well, in the book I talk about, I've been writing about this as I've said for a number of years, and I got an email from somebody who told me her family story. So I talked to various members of her family and told the story in the book. An African-American veteran of World War II, very ambitious and talented. He bought a truck, surplus Army trucks, and reconditioned them to be able to haul sheetrock and other construction materials. He got a contract with Levitt. He was a veteran. Got a contract with Levitt to help build Levittown. He was hauling sheetrock to Levittown, but he wasn't permitted to buy a home there. He was better off financially than many of the people who purchased homes in Levittown, the white people who purchased homes. They were working class men returning from the war. So the GI Bill was available in theory to African Americans, but if the subdivisions that the federal government was creating wouldn't sell homes to them, the availability of the GI Bill didn't do much good.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate it. I love your book. I've bought so many copies. I live locally. I live in this neighborhood, and I grew up in Washington on DuPont Circle, and one side of the circle was mixed, and the other side of the circle was mixed. By the time I graduated from college, that had changed, and all of DuPont Circle had gentrified. So I couldn't afford, as a college student between Howard and GW, to live there. Anyhow, my current question is, what is the impact of zoning? For example, I live in this neighborhood. I have a perfectly acceptable ground floor flat that I could afford to rent to a family. They could go to Murch School or Janney School. They could live downstairs in a one-bedroom with a big living room, dining room, kitchen, a beautiful garden, but I can't do it because of zoning.
Let me talk about zoning more generally. The term I'll use is exclusionary zoning. It's zoning that prohibits, I don't know the particulars of your neighborhood, and I'm not going to try to find out in the next 2 seconds, but many white neighborhoods, white suburbs in this country have exclusionary zoning ordinances that prohibit, I'm not talking about poor people, that prohibit the construction of single-family homes on normal lot sizes, or prohibit the construction of townhouses or attractive apartment units. Those zoning ordinances, and this goes actually to your question, okay, I'm finished with your neighborhood now, I'm not going to talk generally about zoning. Those zoning ordinances date back to the pre-New Deal era, and they were specifically racially motivated, which is something that another part of the history that we've forgotten. In 1917, the Supreme Court ruled that cities could not establish racial zones, that they couldn't say that African Americans could live here and whites could live here, there. Actually, the way in which these ordinances were written that the Supreme Court prohibited in 1917 indicated how integrated the neighborhoods and urban areas were, because the typical ordinances prohibited African Americans from moving onto a block which was majority white. It was an integrated block, but if it was majority white, African Americans couldn't move onto it, and majority black whites couldn't move onto it. And the city of Baltimore was the first one to do this. It had enormous difficulty enforcing it because it ran into problems. There was one block, for example, where there was an African American church, or maybe it was the reverse. Anyhow, it was an African American church, and the minister moved out of his the parsonage in order to have some repairs done. He couldn't move back in because the majority white nature of the block made it illegal for him to live in his own church parsonage. So these were integrated neighborhoods. So the Supreme Court ruled that unconstitutional, not because the Supreme Court was integrationist, but the Supreme Court, for those of you who know some American history, in that time, from the beginning of the 20th century through the mid-1930s, the Supreme Court thought its main role in life was to protect property rights. And the zoning ordinances interfere with the property rights of a homeowner to sell to whomever he wanted. So that was the basis of the Supreme Court decision. City leaders who wanted to segregate their communities were panicked by this decision, because how are they going to do it without these ordinances? And in 1920, Warren Harding was elected president. His Secretary of Commerce was a fellow named Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover established a committee on zoning. And it was made up of prominent segregationists, planners, who in the cities they came from had designed racially designated zones, but understanding the Supreme Court now prohibited it, came up with the idea of economic zones as a way of keeping out African Americans. And they published a pamphlet on zoning that was distributed to every suburb in the country, every jurisdiction in the country, telling them how to zone to exclude low-income families. They didn't say they wanted to exclude African Americans, or they were also concerned about Irish and Italian immigrants, but it was an economic zoning thing. It's very similar to, we've had a recent discussion in this country about President Trump's Muslim ban, where the courts have said that, the ban itself may on its face seem non-discriminatory, but President Trump and his campaign made so many discriminatory statements that we understand what this is really about. Well, the same thing was true of the zoning, the zoning pamphlets and the zoning laws that were adopted. In 1926, the Supreme Court upheld the right of cities and suburbs to impose this kind of zoning. It was the only time in 40 years, 35 years of the Supreme Court in the beginning of the 20th century that they upheld a policy that interfered with property rights, that interfered with the right of a homeowner to do what you're talking about, or that interfered with the right of a developer to build a single-family home on a small lot size. The only time was when they upheld the right of cities to zone out low-income families. The lower court judge said it's obvious that this is designed to exclude colored and immigrant families, and that's unconstitutional according to the 1917 decision, but the Supreme Court ignored the lower court's finding of fact that this was the purpose of the zoning laws, and it upheld zoning. So since then, we've had this economic zoning across the country, as I say, racially motivated initially, I'm not saying that every suburb that has adopted a zoning ordinance was not economically elitist rather than racially discriminatory, but there's a big aspect of racial motivation behind these zoning laws, and it's contributed a great deal to maintaining the segregation that we have in this country, in suburbs around the country.
My question kind of goes back to your thoughts about remedies. I know Philadelphia has a policy, and I'm not sure if it's still active today, but where they're tearing down those big public housing units, and then their public housing authority is buying dilapidated properties and building duplexes or single-family homes in the heart, in the core of the city. And then I guess it's like a lease to buy program where low-income families can buy those homes that the Public Housing Authority has built. Do you think that's a valid and a replicatable model for other cities?
Me again? When do you get a chance? Well, these policies are going on around the country, and typically what happens in them is some families do get to participate in these rent-to-own programs, but the vast majority of families who are displaced don't, because the density is much lower, and so they wind up going somewhere else. Where do they go? Well, they go to the only places that will accept them, and these are new segregated communities in inner ring suburbs. So, many people wondered, when we first started being aware of this as a country again, after Michael Brown was killed by a policeman in Ferguson, Missouri, how did a suburb like Ferguson become majority black? I thought black communities were in cities, not in suburbs. It happened not because of that particular rent-to-own program, because a lot of programs like that, where neighborhoods get either gentrified. In the case of St. Louis, they demolished large swaths of the African-American community that had been created in the central city by the policies that I described before so they demolished these areas in order to build this, the Gateway Arch. It's like half of a McDonald's sign, on the Mississippi River to introduce you to the West Coast or the western states. So they demolished all these areas, and where were the people who lived there going to go? Well, they got vouchers. Instead of public housing, they got vouchers, typically known as Section 8 vouchers. And the Section 8 voucher program is one in which the Housing Authority, with federal money, gives family a subsidy so that they can spend no more than 30% of their income on a market rental at the average rent in the community. Well, that's a fine system, except that there's a curious exception to the Fair Housing Act, and that is that landlords are permitted to discriminate against Section 8 housing vouchers and not accept them. So when in St. Louis, they use this example, and when all of these African-American neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis were demolished, and sometimes for housing, middle-class housing or lower middle-class housing, sometimes for universities, sometimes for big highway exchanges, African-Americans had to go to the only places where their vouchers were accepted. And it turned out in St. Louis, there was the town of Ferguson, there was another one next to it, Jennings, a couple of towns that would accept these vouchers, and these became new segregated communities on the inner ring. And this is happening everywhere in the country. Everywhere in the country where we get gentrification, and historically we got urban renewal, which in the 60s was characterized as Negro removal. Everywhere we got these kinds of programs, it simply displaced the minority population to new segregated communities in inner ring suburbs. Lots of people talk very well about gentrification because it creates diverse communities. It's only transitional diversity, transitional integration, because gradually those communities become unaffordable to the people who used to live there. They can't pay property taxes there anymore. And so they're forced to move to these new segregated communities. So the program is fine, except it's not part of a broad plan of integration. It helps a few people who get those rent-to-own homes, but it's not part of a broader plan to desegregate metropolitan areas, which is required if we're going to deal with this problem successfully.
Mr. Rothstein, I was really impressed with your article, Brown at 60. But what struck me when I read it is that blackness creates whiteness. Discrimination against black people is required for white people to have white privilege. And the fact that Democrats did so much with desegregation and affirmative action, et cetera, has made it impossible for poor whites to have a white home and a white school at their low income, which means that they definitely need Donald Trump. And that's what they were voting for. Am I wrong? Is there some hope for this country other than, right now, I'm assuming that in 10 years, Hispanics will be white because white people are not fools. So is it true that it is essential that black people be the negative out party so that there is white consistency in this country?
Well, it's certainly two sides of the same coin. You can't have superiority without inferiority and vice versa. So yes, there is a white privilege does depend on black subjugation. The reality is that, as you alluded to, poor whites are much more likely to be integrated into middle-class white communities than poor blacks are likely to be integrated into any kind of middle-class community. We don't have, we have lots of poor whites in this country, and in metropolitan areas increasingly, but we don't have white ghettos. They're mixed in with the broader population. So, yes, I agree with you.
And then I'm going to get the mic back to Richard. But I think it's very important to disabuse people of the notion that Donald Trump was elected by poor white people. The median income, I believe, during the Republican primary, the average Trump voter was about $72,000 or so. That is way, way above any sort of income that any sort of, middle-class black person even. That would be a relatively high income for a middle-class black person. So it's important that we not dump this, at the feet of poor white people. Donald Trump swept white people regardless of demographic across the board, gender, class, education, et cetera. He just won.
We're going to take 3 more questions. Thank you both for your books that you've written. They're amazing and they're powerful. And Mr. Rothstein, I agree with the premise that de jure segregation, the law, has pushed us through government programs to segregated neighborhoods. But my question is, how does that then reinforce our de facto segregation, the choices we make? And as a democracy, in theory, our laws are based on our personal choices as a society, our de facto choices that we want things to be a certain way. So we engage with our senators, we engage with our government to make the laws that we have. And so an example of this is the Seattle Public Schools case, Parents Involved, in 2007, in which the Seattle residents of the public school board decided they wanted to integrate their schools again voluntarily. And so they had a program in which they were going to place students based on race to achieve racial balance as an expression of how they wanted the law to be. But then the de facto preferences of a group of parents who wanted segregation to remain sued, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then issued de jure segregation upon Seattle, saying, you're right, it's unconstitutional. So how does this cycle of de facto and de jure racism perpetrate itself, and how do we stop it?
Yeah, that case that you're talking about, the Supreme Court decision, was based on exactly this myth. And it's one of the things that set me on this book. When I read that decision, and I was shocked by, I wasn't surprised that Chief Justice Roberts wrote the plurality opinion saying that Louisville and Seattle was segregated de facto, and therefore there's nothing you could do about it. I was surprised that Stephen Breyer, the Associate Justice, wrote the dissenting opinion in which he accepted this myth of de facto segregation. His argument was that if you have de facto segregation, you should be permitted to integrate even though you can't be compelled to. That was the basis of his dissent. And, you know, I knew a little bit, you know, I read that decision, and I was pretty upset when I read Breyer's dissent. Like I said, I wasn't surprised by Robert's opinion. Because, for example, I remember reading about a case in 1955 when in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the cities involved in this, a black family bought a home, and this not poor people. We're talking about these are middle-class people. This was a black war veteran, Navy war veteran, not an infantryman, a Navy war veteran, bought a home in a white suburb, and the state of Kentucky prosecuted, convicted, and jailed the white seller for sedition. That didn't seem to me like de facto segregation. And, you know, that kind of thing, so that set me off on this. And I also know, for example, in Seattle, that William and Bertha Boeing, who also owned an airplane company, were developers of suburbs all around the city of Seattle that were racially exclusive using these FHA guarantees. That didn't seem to me like de facto segregation. So that parents-involved decision is a good example. Unless we disabuse ourselves of this myth of de facto segregation, we can't even make the most nominal progress that the Louisville and Seattle school districts are trying to make in desegregating. So challenging this myth is the first step we need to take, and Ta-Nehisi, as I said, has done a great job doing it. I'm trying to help him, and others, you need to do it as well. You know, every one of you lives in a school district that is using textbooks that are lying about this history, and every one of you can do something about that.
It's the last time I add on, I promise. But, I mean, honestly, this is why it's so important really to support Richard's work, and why his work is really so significant. I mean, you have to consider, you know, Supreme Court justices are products of some of the finest educational systems in the world, and yet they literally do not understand, in this case, you just literally do not understand a significant episode, a significant portion of American history. If that's true at the Supreme Court level, God knows what's true, you know, when you start going down the ladder to people who have not had access to those institutions. The myth is deep. I mean, the parallel I think about is when John Roberts, and I can't remember whether it was this case or another case, he says the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. But America has never discriminated on the basis of race. It discriminates on the basis of racism, and racism has never required any sort of accurate representation of a race, any more than a hate crime that's committed in the wake of 9/11 requires an actual Muslim. People perpetrate those against Sikhs or whoever. It's the ideology, that's the basis, but we don't understand it. We don't understand that this was a created thing. That's the idea that's implicit in this notion of de facto, that it's just these sort of people that are wandering around and just doing stuff. And therefore, government can't address it, but government created it, you know, so we have a responsibility. So as we just said, until you get to that myth, almost being asked for solutions and actions are way behind that.
So given that we still live in a world where we do have a government agency, and I was going to ask if you were Ben Carson what you would do, but I won't do that to you. But if today I was a president and I put you in charge of HUD, what would you do?
Well, you know, I hate to sound like a broken record, but if I was in charge of HUD, I would appoint a secretary who would go around the country making speeches about the history of residential segregation. That's what I would do, because nothing else would fly. Nothing else would fly. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president, and I've written about this, maybe some of you have read this. He appointed as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development a fellow by the name of George Romney, the father of somebody that you may be familiar with. And as I say, this history was once well known. Nothing that I've talked about today was a secret, and we've forgotten about it because, as I said before, it's too hard to deal with it, but it was once well known. George Romney knew it. He was appointed Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He said, George Romney, the Republican Housing Secretary, said that the federal government has created a white noose around urban centers where African Americans lived, and it's the federal government's obligation to untie that noose. That's what George Romney said. And he began a program which he called Open Communities, in which the federal government withheld federal funds from suburbs for things that all jurisdictions get, like green space and sidewalks and sewers and water projects, all the things that the federal government gives out money for, withheld money from suburbs if they didn't desegregate. If they didn't repeal their exclusionary zoning ordinances, if they didn't accept a fair share of the metropolitan area's moderate income housing, low and moderate income housing, he actually withheld funds from 3 suburbs. One of them was Baltimore County, and he was supported in this action by Spiro Agnew, who had been county executive in Baltimore County and had fought segregationists in an attempt to try to solve some of the problems of Baltimore, because he said the problems of Baltimore, Spiro Agnew said this, the problems of Baltimore are not created in Baltimore, they're created in the suburbs. So he was supported by Spiro Agnew. He withheld funds from Baltimore. He withheld funds from Warren, Michigan, where he had a background himself in fighting the local officials, and he withheld funds from an area in Ohio. And there was a political reaction, we call it a backlash, and President Nixon reined him in, made him cancel the Open Communities Project, forced him out as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and we've had nothing as decent since. But that's because George Romney was able to say things that we've all forgotten. So it's a forgotten history. And I'm not saying that if a new Republican Secretary of Housing and Urban Development were to say the things that George Romney said, that he would get away with it, because there's much less understanding today of these problems and how they arose than there was then. When Ben Carson was, before he was appointed secretary, the Obama administration had adopted a rule which was a bare shadow of what George Romney had tried to do, but it was a shadow. And Ben Carson said, he wrote an article in which he said that this is social engineering, trying to integrate the suburbs. And social engineering always has negative consequences, unintended consequences. But the reality is that integration is an attempt to undo social engineering. The social engineering was the creation of a segregated landscape all across the country. And if we really don't like social engineering, we should undo it.
Hi, I'm Russ Hickman, and I'm from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And
I'm Naomi Armuzi. I'm from Houston, Texas.
And we go to the School for Ethics and Global Leadership here in Washington, D.C., which is a semester program. And so I know firsthand, even as a 17-year-old, the reality of racial segregation in neighborhoods in my city of Winston-Salem. And I know that my state, North Carolina, has a long history of racial discrimination through neighborhoods, and especially through voter laws. And so I was wondering what you think the role of state governments, especially in North Carolina, in restricting voting rights for African Americans has had in perpetuating the problems with neighborhood segregation. And Naomi has an addition to that.
Yeah. And I also wanted to know, how would you describe the current issues of white flight in suburbia and your city communities, and what role does white families play in the continuation of segregated suburbia?
I thought we were going to do this together. Oh. But you have. Well, white flight. This is a typical excuse for segregation. This is a private action. But white flight was possible only because there were all white places to flee to. If we hadn't imposed residential segregation in suburbs around the metropolitan area, there couldn't have been white flight, because every neighborhood would have had a diverse population. So a lot of these things that we think of as being purely private rest on government policy. And, let me take a minute to go into one other, if I may, one other example of this. It's a big explanation for de facto segregation. It was private real estate agents who were steering families to same-race neighborhoods. It wasn't the government. Well, real estate agents are all licensed by the state. Now, I'm not suggesting, I would never suggest that just because somebody is licensed by a state, they become a state actor. If that were the case, everybody in the country would be a state actor because we all have some government involvement, and that would completely blur the distinction between public and private. So I'm not suggesting that, but real estate agents are a different kind of state involvement. Since 1924, the National Association of Real Estate Boards had a code of ethics which stated explicitly that a real estate agent could not sell a home in a white neighborhood to an African American. Now, so this is not a rogue real estate agent happening to, steer people. This is the official policy of every real estate, not anymore, but it was the official policy of every real estate broker in the country and their agents. And state licensing agencies were fully aware of this. So I'm not suggesting they should have been monitoring individual real estate agents, but there was a violation of the 14th Amendment to license a real estate agent who belonged to an organization whose official policy was that you would be expelled and denied the multiple listing services and no longer able to follow your profession if you sold a home to an African American in a white neighborhood. That's state action. That's a violation of the 14th Amendment. In Grosse Pointe, Michigan, the real estate board had a creative system, a point system. So if they were going to sell a home to somebody, they had to rate them on a number of points before they permitted to sell it. And, African Americans got no points, Jews got a couple, Italians got not many more, Irish not many more, and white accent, they get the most points, and so they could buy homes in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. Well, this became known in 1960, and the Michigan Real Estate Commission said that they had to end that system because it was discriminatory as a violation of the Constitution. The state legislature in Michigan then passed a law overruling the Real Estate Commission's policy. The governor of Michigan then vetoed the state legislature's overruling of the Real Estate Commission. And then the Supreme Court the state Supreme Court in Michigan got into the act and said that the Real Estate Commission had no authority over racial discrimination. This real estate commission, they can lift the license of a real estate agent if, he's late in paying alimony to his ex-wife, as that's unethical behavior. But the Supreme Court of Michigan said that racial discrimination was not unethical, and the commission had no jurisdiction over it. Well, that's not de facto segregation. That's not private activity. This is a whole industry which was structured by government, by state government, and all it would have taken, by the way, all it would have taken is lifting the licenses of a couple of real estate agents for discriminatory behavior, and the real estate industry would have had to change. I mean, not just a couple, in one state, but, if states around the country lifted licenses occasionally, that would have been enough to prevent this from happening. So this notion that we have de facto segregation because it was private real estate agents who are acting outside of government to steer people to different neighborhoods is, can I say this? It was nonsense. Voting. Here.
What strikes me about this, I think one of the things that has probably come out of literature and the dialogue around the civil rights movement is voting as a kind of symbolic act, as a kind of pretty thing you do. You vote to honor your ancestors who died. And I think what is disguised by that is voting is how you have a say in how your tax dollars are actually spent. Voting is actually an expression of power. There is a long history since the Civil War, and I guess even before the Civil War, definitely in the North, of depriving black people of the right to vote, which is to say the right to have some sort of say in how the country is run, how their tax dollars are actually spent. And so obviously if you can't vote or if you can't exercise that power at the same level that other groups can, you can't hope to have any sort of influence over policy, over actual housing policy. So the two things are tied together. Richard, I think his point, I wouldn't say exonerating the South, but pointing out that this was not just the South when we start talking about housing policy. And really, I would expand that out into New Deal policy, period. As talked about Social Security, unemployment, et cetera. Nevertheless, it remains true that the inability of African Americans to actually vote during that period made it very, very easy to exclude, and I mean African Americans in the South, to exclude African Americans from broad swaths of New Deal programs. This is, particularly true in North Carolina, where there's, large demographic change that's happening right now. People coming from the North moving in, a growth in Latinos in North Carolina, and folks are attempting to hold on to the old order. And so it's not a mistake that you're seeing these draconian voting laws to, allow people to, do the same sorts of things that they would have been able to do 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I think the fight is really, really, really important. It's inextricably tied. The two are together. So I think you're right on the right path. Drew.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I think it's interesting. First, the history is not particularly mysterious to Black people. Most Black people are aware of this history because our grandparents who are still alive endured it. But I would like to just ask a question. The policies were nefarious and intentional in segregating housing because, as you point out in your book, housing is sort of the gateway to all the other disenfranchisement. And so I guess the question that I have is about you said that one of the ways that we resolve this is by fixing the textbooks and having people sort of acknowledge what the history is so that we can have that as a starting point for fixing it. But I think the question I have is how do you get to that acknowledgement when the effort was intentional because it upholds so many other myths? So if Black people aren't poor because they're just not working hard enough, then maybe they are working as hard as everybody else, and you, the other, you're not rich because you're so much smarter than everybody else. You're wealthy because of these policies. How do you start? I mean, you have to undo a whole bunch of myths that take down a whole bunch of structures in the minds of even good and liberal and honest white people in this country, that folks aren't really, I don't know that folks are really ready to do that. And so I'm curious about how we start having this conversation. It's not about blame at all. It's about acknowledgement so that we can grow to be the country that we intended to be, not just be pretending to be that country.
So that's such a beautiful question because I think it gets right at the heart of things, because I think like there's a kind of weak, soft, moist hope. Not all hope, but a kind of weak, moist hope that says, well, if we can't, why can't we just educate everybody and then everything will be okay? But that begs, why was it forgotten in the first place? Why do we keep forgetting? Why do we have to, why are we, some 150 years plus removed from the Civil War and still having to deal with that myth? Why did it take a terrorist attack to get a Confederate flag? You get into all of these other things, and what you begin to realize is that these lies, these myths, are not side courses. They're not, branches. They're central to the American idea, and to acknowledge them assaults in some really, really profound way the narrative that I think a lot of Americans have. How can you have these theories of American exceptionalism when you understand that, just to speak broadly here, that, all of that exceptionalism was actually built on the torture and the plunder and the destruction, of human beings? How do you maintain that? I don't know that you do. But here's what I know about African American progress in this country. it has never come through sheer moral appeal. It just hasn't. It just hasn't. It's not like suddenly in 1860, 1861, 62, folks realized that enslavement was wrong. At that point, African Americans had been making the case since they got here in 1619. So you're talking about folks having made the case for over 200 years at that point. It's not as though, all praise to Martin Luther King and the activists of that period, but it's not as though they were that much more dynamic than the activists that came before them. I mean no disrespect to them. In fact, to the contrary, I mean to honor all the folks that came before them. What you have in these cases is some sort of exterior interest. And so in the case of enslavement, literally the country was threatened with destruction. If the country allows the South to leave, then who knows who can leave next? You don't have an American in that case. And so it became true that in order to maintain union, you had to destroy enslavement. Civil rights movement, pretty much the same thing. You have the exterior threat of the Cold War. And so American racism becomes an international embarrassment to this country. I don't know that you could have had the civil rights movement without the Cold War, without World War II. I'm not sure it would have happened. What that means is that it's the responsibility of those who know, those who push, those who want this country to move away, from myth to actual history, not to sit at home, and be lazy and say, well, it'll never happen. But you have to be there, pushing, when that exterior event happens, so that you can push through that window. That's the way it works. The window is not always open. But if nobody's pushing, then once the window opens, there'll be no chance to go through. That's a bit disconcerting, because it means that it's not totally all up to us. But that's really the fate of being a minority in a country like this. That's the situation we're in. And so I think what that allows for is action, actually doing something, but at the same time a kind of realistic action, that doesn't, because I think a lot of times what happens when people get into this sort of place of moist hope, weak hope, when things don't go the way they think, they go into despair. So Donald Trump gets elected and people say, I give up. I'm moving to Canada, I'm going wherever. Which is, Donald Trump is nothing compared to the long history of things that African Americans in this country have actually had to endure and keep enduring. So I think if you can have some sort of long-term vision, it says that it's your responsibility to struggle even when, perhaps even more so, when it looks like there's no solution on the horizon, then you can keep on. The expectation has to be beyond your lifetime, actually. You're not going to answer, Richard?
Well, I'll just add this point, and I feel sort of strongly about this. We're all in this together. You have no idea the number of audiences I've spoken to where African Americans didn't understand this history and were shocked by it. It's not the case that African Americans certainly know that they are second-class citizens of this country. They don't understand the history that I've been describing, and that any more than whites do, and that robs them of a weapon, as it does all people. The other thing I think Ta-Nehisi said, I agree, it's both. It takes external forces and a movement that's ready to take advantage of those forces. The civil rights victories might not have happened without the Cold War, but the Cold War itself wouldn't have done it without a civil rights movement. And so both are necessary, and that's why this... And the other thing is we have made some progress, I would say. We can't forget that. We've made racial progress in many areas. And so I hold out hope that there's possible for more progress. Being something of a attempted scholar, I happen to believe that knowledge is power. And so it's, I think that understanding this history does give us an additional weapon that we can use, but I agree it's not the only weapon. Simply if we understand this history, things aren't going to just fall into place.
Thank you all for coming. Please give a huge round of applause to our speakers.